Abandoned for 40 years, stretching over 600,000 square feet, and filled with lots of history. This abandoned rayon factory has been on my list for quite some time. Even knowing all of that, I can still say I wasn't expecting all of this. It was the end of winter when I realized it had been far too long since my last exploration. So I started planning my trip around one simple idea. Simple. That's the idea. You know, long walks on the beach, the wide open road, an old abandoned fabric factory. But unfortunately, things are never as simple as I'd like. Just days before the trip, I learned that this abandoned factory is actually connected to an active facility. It was like this factory had become some sort of parasitic growth, forever feeding off of the life of its still living counterpart. Nevertheless, I set out on my journey to document this place, and after over 3 hours of driving, I began the 2-mile walk to the factory. Eventually I came upon a rather peculiar sight. A barbed wire fence surrounding nothing? I half expected to see a streak of tigers emerge from the tall grass. Whatever the reason, someone had certainly gone to a lot of effort to keep people out, even taking the time to reinforce the small gaps in the bottom of the fence. After some time, I found a service road that seemed to be heading in the right direction. Unfortunately, my access was blocked by an impassable gate. But after a grueling walk through the woods, I was able to bypass the gate. I followed the road, which turned out to be little more than a grass path, until I reached a fork in the road. The factory was now clearly in sight, making this an easy decision. I wanted to approach this place from the far side of the active facility for, well, obvious reasons. And after finding a way through a couple more fences, I was finally there. Hopper cars like this one were likely used to transport the chemicals needed to manufacture rayon, although this one looks to still be in use by the active factory. Eventually I reached a small building that was probably used to direct incoming trains. I quickly set up the rest of my gear before diving straight into the Explorer. I was met with a rather empty warehouse-like room. While the emptiness may look lackluster to the untrained eye, my hopes were already lifted by the sight of several pieces of equipment that had been left behind. It wasn't much, but it was an indication that there was more to come. I then found a human-sized elevator where ironically humans weren't allowed, leading me to believe that this room was once used for some combination of storage and shipping. While I generally save the basement for last, this time I decided to start with it due to the easy access provided by this large ramp. At the bottom, I was immediately met with a dark, narrow passage that unfortunately led nowhere other than some sticky, thick mud. I quickly found out that the basement was largely empty, with no signs of life. Well, aside from this monster living in a trash compactor. I then found the world's worst break room that surprisingly still had intact lighting. As I walked from room to room, the sheer size of this place was beginning to become apparent. I then found a pretty large transformer, along with a wooden ladder that was amazingly still standing after spending 40 years in a damp basement. I guess the basement wasn't completely gutted after all. I then saw a glimpse of the outside world, before continuing down a rather charming tunnel. At the end, I found the remnants of what looked to be a boiler system. But I didn't want to spend all day in the basement. After all, winter wasn't quite over yet, so my daylight was limited. And I definitely did not want to find my way back in the dark. However, my endless curiosity was put to a halt by a tunnel that was too flooded to traverse, leaving me with only one way forward, although my woes were quickly forgotten. I was brought back to reality by the sight of a modern door illuminated by artificial light, which could only mean that I was very close to the active factory. Not wanting to miss out on any cool finds, I quickly investigated the surrounding area, with the constant hum of electricity giving me a sense of urgency. I took one last look at this door to the outside world, before plunging back into a world of my own. I carefully made my way up a staircase of questionable stability, but I was immediately glad that I did. This room was likely used to power the whole factory, judging by the massive steam generator and all of the nearby electrical equipment. As cool as it all was, I had to be efficient with my filming if I wanted to be able to see this whole place. I then stumbled upon a storeroom that was full of old parts. The floor of this room felt very sturdy, but this halfway submerged pipe revealed that I was actually standing on several inches of sediment. I then found two rather large coal furnaces, which would have provided the steam used by the generator in the adjacent room. I then decided to check out more of the nearby rooms, but my finds paled in comparison. I soon found myself back outside, where I made the astonishing discovery that I was no longer in the main building. I must have crossed the train tracks using the underground tunnel into the secondary building, that I shall now refer to as the powerhouse. While I thoroughly enjoyed my time in the powerhouse, I managed to burn up a considerable amount of daylight here, and I still had the better part of a 600,000 square foot building to explore. Well, I guess I had time for a few more exterior shots first. Now it was time to get down to business. As is often the case with these old factories, most of the space was empty, so the trick was seeking out the interesting parts in as little time as possible. Eventually I stumbled upon a luscious urban jungle. Now it was back to searching. Fortunately, it wasn't long before I found an old machine tucked away in a cozy little room. I then carefully avoided becoming the next Darwin Award winner, before discovering this peculiar room full of... Now let me just say that I never thought I'd be reading a sewing blog to better understand an abandoned place, but I think it's about time that I explain what this place was all about. Rayon was the first man-made fiber, and this factory was one of the first that utilized new manufacturing techniques to produce continuous, uniform rayon thread at a massive scale. But more on that later. Built in the late 30s, this factory was completed just in time to support America in the war effort, where rayon was used in everything from clothing to parachutes, and even tires, where Tyrone cord fabric was used as a cheaper alternative to rubber. But how does all of this relate back to this room? Well, as the rayon thread was created, it was immediately wound up onto these jumbo bobbins, which could hold several pounds of thread apiece. It was then sometimes transferred to cones for use in certain fabrication processes. These cones would have been stored and transported on these cone holders, for lack of a better term. However, these jumbo bobbins could also be directly used for making Tyrone fabric. These racks, called creels, allowed for the easy organizing and unwinding of rayon thread onto one ginormous bobbin, which would go on to provide the warp or vertical threads used in weaving fabric. Oh, not to mention they could hold up to 1,000 pounds of rayon thread. Well, in case the history of thread making was a little too slow for you, let me pick up the pace. I searched around for a little while until I found a secure storage room. I then discovered a couple of Jawa suction tubes before finally finding another staircase. I climbed up a pile of rubble to get a better look at some machines, which were likely used to churn wood pulp and other chemicals together. Wood pulp is basically the main ingredient in rayon. I then found a temperature control station, along with a couple of missing chemical vats. And after another flight of stairs, I finally found a ladder to the top. Now I don't know when's the last time you put a 40-year disused ladder to the test, but this one was top-notch. Upon reaching the top, I was immediately impressed by the view. After fighting my way back through the overgrowth, I began my descent using a set of highly technical moves that I assure you look much more ridiculous on camera than in reality. At some point during that, my lens hood came loose, plummeting down the stairwell. Fortunately, this isn't the first time this has happened, and I was able to retrieve it with no casualties. I then made my way back to the urban jungle, where I found some sort of an open concept working space, complete with a reflective pool and plenty of light. Farther into this room, I found a dismantled time card system, followed by another set of creels. And can we just take a moment to appreciate the charming ambience of this room? I then found another secure storage room, with a desk showcasing what 40 years of dust looks like. I continued heading deeper into this section of the factory, until I rounded another corner, where I was absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of interesting things left behind. I eventually found my way back to the reflective room, where I even made a few more finds that I had previously overlooked. It seemed that most of the equipment left behind had been collected together into one section of the factory, forming a sort of urban explorer's museum. Perhaps this was done as a form of long-term storage, for items that weren't valuable enough to sell, but might, just maybe, have a use someday. I then found a stack of old blueprints, and if only I had more time, a whole filing cabinet full of them too. Despite only following a third of the posted rules, I decided to see what lay beyond this stairwell, and to my surprise, it was nothing. And after staring into the abyss for almost too long, I made my way back to the urban jungle, where I continued heading toward the opposite side of the factory. Sealed doorways served as a constant reminder of how close I was to the active facility. Eventually I reached a long corridor, which appeared to stretch all the way from the active end of the facility to the other side of the building. Well, let's see what this area is all about. I believe that most of the front section of this building was used for office space, although the lack of desks, filing cabinets, and other typical office decor made it hard to differentiate it from the rest of the factory. It was hard to imagine that hundreds of workers would begin their day just across this field, where the employee parking lot used to lay. I then took one last look at the flowers of the urban forest before beginning my walk back to the center of the factory. My time was running out, but I still had one more wing I wanted to explore. I was quickly rewarded with the discovery of several mostly intact spinning machines. Now let me give you a quick, overly simplified summary of how these machines work. You take your dissolved wood pulp solution and push it through a small set of holes called a spinneret. You know, like a spider, or maybe a tube of toothpaste. Except in our case, an acid bath is required to harden this wood pulp solution into a solid thread. These containers were possibly used to hold this acid, or maybe they just contained oil for the machines. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. While I'm not certain what was stored in these huge spaceship-like containers, I can say that they felt incredibly massive in person. They also made for some great reverb. Now I suppose I should talk a bit about what led to this factory's closure. But I mean, come on, isn't it obvious? Have you ever heard your friends say, "Hey, check out my new Rayon shirt"? Not that people actually brag about the material of their shirt, but you get my point. Following the height of the rayon industry during World War II, nylon and other new synthetic fibers began to decrease demand for rayon. While some attempts were made to diversify, the plant's profits continued to decline until it was ultimately closed in the early 80s. With that out of the way, I continued my journey into another warehouse-like room. I quickly got a couple of shots, knowing that I was already on borrowed time. After finding my way behind this pile of pallets, I slid under this door, only to find that I had made it full circle all the way back to where I began. After making my way outside, I took a few moments to appreciate these buildings in the evening light. Who knows what the future has in store for them? But for me, it was time to begin my long walk out of here.